everyone, to this episode of Beyond the Crucible. I'm Gary Schneeberger, the co-host of the show, and you have clicked play on. We hope you've clicked subscribe to a podcast that deals with what we call Crucible Experiences. Now, what are Crucible Experiences? You may ask if you're somewhat new to the show. Crucible Experiences are those things, traumas, setbacks, failures, tragedies, those things that happen to us or sometimes that we cause to happen ourselves that can knock the wind out of our sails, that can knock the air out of our lungs, that very really change the trajectory of our lives. But here's the good news. We talk about them on this show, not so we can build a virtual campfire and gather around it and swap war stories and sort of feel bad for ourselves. We talk about it here so that we can find hope and healing through the stories of people who have moved beyond their crucibles. And one person who has moved beyond his crucible is the host of the show, then the author of the just released book, Crucible Leadership, Embrace Your Trials to Lead a Life of Significance. And that would be Warwick Fairfax. Welcome, Warwick.
Thanks so much. Very much looking forward to it.
We have a treat for you today, listener, because we have a very accomplished guest who has some very excellent insights into ways to, as he puts it, scale up various aspects of your life and your leadership. And that guest is Nick Bradley, who's a renowned entrepreneur, investor, author, speaker, and business growth expert. He has built, bought, and sold 22 businesses with a combined valuation of over $5 billion. Sidebar, that's the most money I've talked about on this show since we talked about Warwick's Crucible. So that's impressive. Nick empowers business leaders and investors to create valuable businesses that create global impact. His Scale Up Your Business podcast, which ranks #1 on iTunes and Spotify's business charts, has more than 150,000 downloads in more than 130 countries. Nick is committed to fostering entrepreneurship and building empires as a global force for good. And with 67 marathons and 24 ultra marathons to his credit, those numbers may be out of date now, Nick. You can keep us up to date as we go forward. He demonstrates excellence and tenacity outside of the business world as well. This is going to be a very informative conversation, Warwick, so I'm looking forward to you getting it kicked off.
Well, Nick, thanks again, and wonderful to have a fellow Australian. You were very kind to have me on your podcast, Scale Up Your Business, and we had a tremendous conversation. So before we get into Scale Up Your Business, I'd love a bit of the origin story, the Nick Bradley origin story. Obviously from Australia, but you lived in the UK for like close to 20 years. I think married a girl from over there, I'm guessing in the UK. So it's kind of what happens. I married an American girl and she brought me back to the US. So yeah, it kind of happens. So which is all good. But so tell me, kind of what's the origin story of your interest in entrepreneurship, equity? You grew up in Adelaide, so tell me a bit about how you grew up, and you've clearly always had a fascination with entrepreneurship. So how did all that happen?
Well, gentlemen, thank you for the grandesque welcome. Do you know what's funny? When I hear those sort of things, I realize some of the numbers are out of date. I think the podcast is now, I think it's 350,000 downloads.
Oh my gosh!
So I need to speak to my team. I need to go back and say, guys, get the stats right. But, but back to what you said, Gary, the marathon numbers are about right because my knees are buggered these days. So, it's just the podcast listens, and I've actually sold 25 businesses as well. Anyway, we're not counting, right? We're not counting. Origin story. Yeah. So as you said, I grew up in this place called Adelaide. It's funny, right? I can't really lie about it because Australia so well, right? I can often sort of say things about Adelaide and people go, oh, it sounds like this nice, quaint little town. I often say it's famous for three things. Sharks, big sharks. They filmed a lot of Jaws open water scenes there. Lots of churches, heaps of, I think it's called the City of Churches.
Yeah.
And the third thing, which always freaks people out, is serial killers. we had this kind of spate of serial killers. Seriously, like,
Wow.
yeah, this is not the podcast to go into that. But I suppose the summary of that is I had to leave, and I did. And I got into the world of media, and that's where you and I sort of connected a little bit. I worked for Rupert Murdoch for a number of years, specifically for his uncle, who owned a company called Murdoch Magazines. And I sort of cut my teeth in that world for a number of years, which got me to the UK because I left that company and worked for a business called EMAP, East Midlands Allied Press. And I suppose it was like 15 years in corporate, in reasonably senior leadership positions. I was in sort of board level roles before I was 30, but I had my first taste of exiting businesses around 2007 when we sold EMAP to a couple of private equity firms and also a bigger German publisher. And I was involved in the sort of transition before exit, and then I saw what happened after exit. And I thought I need to go a little bit deeper into this world. So I joined another company called Getty Images based out of Seattle, but I was working for them in London and New York. And that was a business that was scaled through a number of different private equity investments and exits. And we did multiple numbers of acquisitions when I was there. In fact, I was involved with about 30 of them. I think it's over 100 acquisitions in total. And that just got me into this whole world of, let's call it investment banking, corporate finance, high level wealth creation, all through M&A, mergers and acquisitions. And, I won't get to the punchline because it is, the Crucible leadership story. But let's just say the person I am today versus the person I was through that pretty amazing ride is very, very different because of some things that happened. But that's how it all started. And I got kind of addicted to this world of cut and thrust, private equity, wealth, money, power, status. And it served me for a certain period of time. But then after a while, I needed to make a few changes.
So, and that's fascinating. And one of the other things I think of Adelaide being famous for is wine, the Barossa Valley. And at least in the US, you see wine bottles with, it'll say like Southeastern Australia. I don't know what that means. Southeastern Australia could be like 70% of the population or something. As in,
it's like the whole of Great Britain fits in that, I think. Yeah, but they don't get it right.
Yeah, I mean, were your parents entrepreneurs? I mean, where do you get this sort of this business gene of loving the cut and thrust of entrepreneurship and business? Where'd that come from?
So this is an interesting part of the story. I had a business in Adelaide before I moved to Sydney when I started moving into the world of publishing. And it was a small personal training business. But at the time, we're talking sort of late 80s, early 90s, personal training wasn't a thing. The people who had personal trainers were doctors, lawyers, stockbrokers. It wasn't something that's as commonplace as it is today. And I started that business not really knowing much, but, my grandfather, who was a big influence on me growing up, he was like, are you really going to do this? Why don't you go get a job? A job equals safety. Right. And I had that in the back of my mind. So I closed the business down. I sold it to a friend, not for much money, because I just sold my client list, really. But what was interesting about that whole first introduction to entrepreneurship is I met some very, very wealthy, powerful, influential people. And that was how I ended up meeting Matt Hambry and Rupert Murdoch through that, having a personal training business. But the story is I sort of thought, okay, well, I'm not going to do this entrepreneurial thing. Everyone in my family is saying it's not a good thing to do. Go and get a job. So that's what I did. And I suppose the long story short of that is 15 years of my life was a frustrated entrepreneur, or they call them entrepreneurs or something crazy like that, in businesses. And I just kept getting either promoted or sacked. There was no middle ground. So I got promoted up because I was this chippy Australian guy, or I annoyed someone on the ladder upwards, who wanted the job I was going for or something else, and then I got sacked. And that's kind of how it happened. But I was sacked within the companies, so I was moved around these divisions. but here's the interesting part to your question, right? So I was this frustrated entrepreneur. I was quite successful, but I wasn't really happy with what I was doing. And what happened was my father, he left our family when I was 2 years of age.
Oh my gosh.
The usual stuff that happens, mum and him just sort of fell out. But then he came back into my life in my late 30s. So it was something like 35 years difference. And he was a very, very successful entrepreneur in Australia. He had a business, a jewelry business that was based in Collins Street. In fact, he had a couple of different sites in Melbourne. And he lost that business in his early 40s because there was a bombing, a terrorist bombing, the Turkish consulate. And he went from being effectively a millionaire to being bankrupt within the space of this incident because there's no insurance for things like that. Now, I didn't know any of this, right? None of this. But then he came back into my life and I realized that, he'd done this. He was very much an entrepreneur. After that incident, he ended up building another business in his 40s into his 50s and, effectively a millionaire again in a separate business. So when I met him, I realized that I had these kind of genes, these desires, this different outlook, whatever you want to define entrepreneurship as, that for many years I would repressed. And it was when I met him, all of a sudden it was like, wow, perhaps I need to lean into this a bit more.
But it sounds like he wasn't as big an influence in your life as maybe perhaps he had some influence later. So, one of the things that, and before we get into sort of the Crucible, people need to understand is in the U.S., it really is a place that encourages you to risk. Failure's okay because, hey, it's the land of entrepreneurship, the land of venture capital. England, at least when I was there in college, tended to be kind of pretty cautious. I don't know if Australia's in between, but there's something in Australia that you'd be very familiar with, the tall poppy syndrome, is that anything other than sports, if you try to succeed, it's like, well, you were an idiot for trying that. Of course you'd fail. And there's, entrepreneurs. I mean, there are obviously a lot of entrepreneurs, but culturally, at least maybe when I was growing up, I think when you were growing up, there's not always a lot of support for risk-taking, get a job, be safe. So you don't have friends and family always fostering the notion of take a risk, go for it kind of thing. Because if you muck up, it'll be like, I knew you'd do that. That was really stupid, wasn't it, Nick? I mean, you're an idiot. Why'd you do that, Nick?
Yeah.
I could have told you that wouldn't have worked.
I'm with you.
But you really fought through all that sort of cultural sort of conservatism.
I didn't know any better, Warwick. You see, so the thing is, right, he left in that gap, right, that 35-year gap. I had no visibility of what he was doing.
Right.
The only time that I realized he was even an entrepreneur or who had his own businesses or any of that sort of stuff, I'm sort of 35, 37, that sort of window. So everything I'd been told previous to that was that, he wasn't a very nice guy, bit of a bum, no hoper sort of thing. But actually all of that wasn't true. So I was like, oh, wow, this is the thing. So he influenced me quite a lot once I'd met him.
Right.
But before that, I had no visibility of that.
Yeah, you were really you had this inner conviction that this is what I want to do, and you went for it, which is really remarkable. So you were in these companies. You were somebody that wasn't afraid to offer your opinion, and sometimes that's accepted well. Those who are maybe insecure, it's like, Nick, no thank you for your opinion. You've given it to me about 10 times on this subject. You just be quiet, go away. And, there's some people that, unfortunately are too insecure or small-minded that doesn't work. But at some point you went to be an entrepreneur yourself and got into, private equity. So how did that transition happen from just working within a corporate sphere to more going into private equity, venture capital, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so my corporate career from the outside looking in was pretty successful, as I said to you beforehand, in terms of positions and money and roles, all those sort of things, responsibility. When I got into private equity, it felt like a natural fit because I was the guy that would effectively go and fix up problems. So the private equity firms would put me into situations that they found quite difficult operationally. So I wasn't the guy who would sit back with the spreadsheet, the MBA from Harvard and all that. I wasn't that guy. I was, let's go in there and see if the people in this business can actually make it work and create value. And if they couldn't, for the assessment that I would give from being in there, then I would be the person who would deliver the change, the transformation. And I was remunerated by both my time spent doing that, but also the amount of value I could create by any change that I made. So if a business was invested in by a private equity firm, the investment went backwards, so it wasn't worth as much as what they paid for it. I would be paid, if you like, on what I could do to get it back to zero, get it back to above water, and then any growth that could come from it. And so I found my niche in that. So this was, I wouldn't call myself an entrepreneur then, but I was operating in a very, very precise way in a very, very interesting environment.
Yeah, it was an entrepreneurial spirit of, okay, we need to make some changes here, get value for the shareholders, and usually want it done fairly quickly. So you did that for a while, and it sounds like you were very good at it, sort of the turnaround guy, which is very valued in businesses. Somebody can come around and make a big change quickly, which obviously all investors want, understandably. So you did that. But so does that kind of lead into I think what you call the teeth incident, where
the teeth incident,
a lot of bad things happened. Is that so? It sounds like professionally things were going gangbusters. Things were going really well. You were very good at what you did. You've had almost like a Liam Neeson, like a particular special set of skills, right? That not
it's
everybody
very much
does.
Like that. Yeah, it is.
And again, I'm not trying to. I'm being flippant, but I'm not. But you were seriously good at what you were doing, and you were paid understandably, which is as it should be in a market economy. If you provide value, you should share in the profits. That's what the whole market economy is built on. It makes total sense. So you were doing really well, and at one level you enjoyed what you were doing, but yet. So talk about how you were succeeding. You're doing tremendously, and then that led into the teeth incident, which led to a pivot in your life. So talk about. The crucible, the teeth, and the pivot.
There's nothing worse than getting a conscience, right? It's a little bit like, probably the best way to describe it is if any listeners have seen Jerry Maguire, where he kind of wakes up one day and he writes this sort of memorandum, which gets him sacked. It was a bit like that. But there was a lot of things going on at the time.
Right.
So when you get up to the top table in some of these, investment businesses, private equity firms, that sort of stuff. There are some certain decisions that are made that are very much about the money that's going to be created, and I was involved in some of those situations where the value that we were extracting from entrepreneurs who built good businesses was disproportionately favored towards the private equity firms and the investors. So we would actively go out there and try and get deals, right? And you could argue that's fair, what's that whole caveat emptor sort of thing, right?
Sure.
But there's a point where, and I know this now more so because I've delved right into it. A lot of the people who build great businesses are good at doing that, but they don't know how to manage what happens, up in the echelons of exits and things like that. And you see that all the time. You see people who sell businesses, but they don't really get the value for it. And I was starting to sort of develop this conscience around it, thinking, do I really want to go and do this when, I'm not effectively lying, but the integrity levels of what I'm doing is not where I want to play. Now, why I started to develop this conscience is partly because my dad had come back into my world. And I realized that as a successful entrepreneur, the people that I was screwing over were people like him. And I'm thinking, oh God, this is not feeling very good. And I was starting to get a bit sick, right? Just, I wasn't feeling very good. I was feeling very stressed. And then two things happened. Firstly, I went away on this trip to Vermont, and my dad flew there from Melbourne. I was living in the UK. He was living
I'm sorry, you flew to where?
To Vermont. Vermont in
Vermont.
US.
Vermont. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yes, your accent's better than mine.
No worries.
And I ran a race there. I ran they've got a 100-mile race.
Sure.
I ran the 100 kilometers, because I was obviously not strong enough to do the 100-mile. But anyway, so my dad turns up. We spend this amazing 2 weeks together.
Yeah.
We leave. Everything's great. He's hanging out with my daughter, who's a couple of years old, and literally 12 months to the day later, I'm in Melbourne by his bed, and he dies that day.
Oh my gosh.
He gets very, very aggressive cancer. Lots of things go wrong. So I've gone from this kind of real connection, starting to question things, starting to build a relationship with my dad after 30 odd years, realizing that actually he's a very successful entrepreneur. Perhaps that's who I should have been. Perhaps I made the wrong decision with my fitness business. Perhaps I should have done it. All these things are going on, right? Then he dies suddenly. Now, I sort of come back from that. I come back to the UK, and a couple of weeks after that, I wake up in the middle of the night. It's about 3 a.m. and I'm in a lot of pain. And my face is all swollen. The right side of my jaw is really just throbbing. And I go into the bathroom and I look in the mirror and it's all red and swollen. It's like I've been punched in the face. And what's happened is I have literally gripped my teeth, clenched my teeth in my sleep through probably a culmination of so many things going on that I've partly explained. And I cracked the two molars, like not just cracked them, like they're shattered. Like there's actually teeth in my mouth. I can taste
my
them.
gosh.
And first thing happens, like I'm awake, right? I take some pills. In the morning, I go to the doctor as soon as I can get there. They send me to the dentist. They examine it. The dentist says, I've only seen this happen before, and it's usually people who are in very high stress situations. And I sort of spoke to my wife after this, after I got it sorted out, and said, I've got to change this. I can't do this anymore. And, I literally, that was the moment that I did change it. And within the following days, weeks, months after that is when I started to do the stuff I'm doing now.
Before you ask the next question, Warwick, I want to, no pun intended about crooked teeth or broken teeth. I want to drill down into something you said, Nick, when you started maybe 7-8 minutes ago in this conversation. You just very matter-of-factly said that your life from the outside looking in was successful. What you've just described at the end of your story there was from the inside looking out, not so much so. And I think a lot of our listeners maybe find themselves in that same position, that success sometimes can be a crucible in and of itself if it doesn't provide those things that Warwick talks about that lead to a life of significance. Would you say that was as much or sort of as much a crucible as the teeth incident was, what you realized that from the outside looking in, everything was successful, but from the other direction, it wasn't?
I know this now because I've examined it more for myself and others. I know there's lots of millionaires who still cry to sleep, right? So they may look great. Like, I had everything, right? The cars, the houses, the whole piece, but I wasn't living to what I now understand were proper values that inspired me, so that I could create wealth and impact. But to your point, Gary, yes. I mean, at the extreme of it, a lot of people don't make decisions. They sit within areas where they're sort of it's not too bad. It's not bad enough that they make change. So it's not great. It's not bad. It's in the middle. And that's what I was. I was looking at the outside, I didn't look great, but actually I wasn't feeling congruent.
I mean, that's sort of fascinating because I think of that quote from Thoreau, we can live lives of quiet discontent. I mean, you weren't like sobbing on the floor, but it seemed like there was something nagging within you saying, is this all there is? Or I'm just tired of coming in and, getting rid of the previous regime. And, maybe it's not about lying, but, maybe there was other choices that may have been better for a wider group of constituencies, employees, owners, community, but, maybe not, the shareholders in private equity. And, there's all sorts of issues, but when you're on a track, you tend to block out those other thoughts because they're uncomfortable. And you just focus, okay, I've got a job here and, carried emptor or buyer beware and all that. But it just sounds like maybe it was with your dad dying, those thoughts, because some people don't come to that pivot point, but you did. Why do you think you hit that pivot when you probably know scores of people that were just like you, your age, your time of life, and they didn't pivot? They said, I hear what you're saying, but it's the world we live in, and let's just keep going. Why did you pivot when so many don't?
I'll answer that. But before I do, I want to say that most people never will. And that is the travesty for me, right? In different ways, right? It's the same as someone who's in the job they hate for years, and then all of a sudden they realize that time is running out to make any changes. I think, I was lucky because I had an inflection point. The inflection point, which, however you think about these things,
sure.
I believe these things serve you, right? So my dad coming back in and giving me a message at that point, which I did resist. He tried to get back into my life multiple times, but there was a point where I thought, what, let's just see where this goes. That created the inflection point for me to, back to my point around things are either really good or really bad. It got to a point where things were so bad that I needed to change it. That's the inflection point, right? And so any fear I had previously of maybe going out and building a business, building an empire, all the different things I'm sort of more involved in now, I was too scared to leave the comfort of, 6, 7 figure money coming in all the time until the pain got so bad I needed to make that change. And the pain was realistically health. Am I showing up as a good example for my kids? Am I that person? And if I answered those honestly at the point in time, I wasn't, and those things are important to me.
So I want to shift to what you do now, but just so that sometimes opposites, or I want to say darkness illuminates the light, but maybe challenges illuminate the light, so that we can understand better what you do now. What was it about your life or what you were doing that was causing you so much anxiety within you, that was causing so much inner turmoil? Because it wasn't like you were doing anything illegal. You were just doing standard operating practice, perhaps, in your industry. So what's wrong with, it's the market economy, but yet something was really troubling you. How would you sort of summarize the elements that were troubling you so much that caused you to shift?
There's no such thing in my mind as what I call, standardized integrity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what you think and what I think are different things. We're not wrong. It's whatever, whatever feels comfortable. There were decisions, nothing was illegal, of course, but I would sit in rooms and the conversation would be, just create fear and uncertainty in the mind of that entrepreneur so we can get a lower value. Say some stuff here, which is kind of on the borders of being real, just so we can, create a wedge. So it's more unethical than what I would call illegal, but it's like, really, do we, and I think there was a point in time where I was so driven around achievement that I didn't care about that, right? Yeah, whatever. Yeah. But once I met my dad and that period of time was over a few years, he came back in, I started to question things differently. I thought, I'm now a dad myself. All of that started to happen. Do I really want to be this person? And how important is it anyway? And so that was the thinking. So I don't, there are still people who are in that and they may be very happy, but that's where their integrity is different. I don't judge it. But for me at that point in time, I realized I needed to make a bigger contribution to make me feel more complete.
I mean, that's fascinating, because in business, there's often this notion that so long as it's legal, whatever it takes to succeed, if I can get, an advantage over my opponent, if you will, by, shading how I express what happens, it's all part of the, it's all part of the game, whatever it takes, providing it's legal to win. I mean, they're free to use whatever tactics they want to on me, and let's just go at it and see who wins. And it just there's that notion, but I have this sense that everybody has different values, but just this notion of just trying to shade the truth to succeed. There may be people that feel fine about that, but that, to me, from my perspective, goes against what it means to be human. So everybody can choose their values, but they can't exactly choose the consequences. They can't choose what, going that certain path will have on them, which is why, as we talked about earlier, there's a lot of very wealthy people who aren't particularly happy, because if it's all about narcissism and about making you rich and not giving back to anybody else, I've yet to meet that person who's really joyful and fulfilled, because you can't fight your inherent human design, which I don't think we're designed to be narcissistic or to be, let's just run over people. At a certain deep level, people may fool themselves into thinking they're okay, but see how much they're drinking, see the number of marriages, there'll be evidence that says not everything is honky-dory. So does that kind of make sense? I'm not so much judging.
No, you are
making
saying, sense to me.
Yeah.
And listen, as I said, I think I've seen too many situations in that world. I was in the private equity world for a decade, and I've seen lots of people, turning to alcohol, turning to other things to try and feel more complete, or maybe to mask stuff. So I'm not saying it's all bad. What's interesting is actually there's a massive change in that whole world in the last few years than what it was in the beginning when I was involved. But I think there's a certain point that as humans, we know right and wrong. You're right about business. We can make a choice that it's fair game, right? If I can beat you in an arm wrestle, then I'm great, right? But there's a point here whereby I didn't feel happy with that. And I grew greater awareness through the situation that happened over a number of years, and it just kept culminating. It's like that feeling in the pit of your stomach and you go like, you know, something's not 100% right, but you can't answer it. It took me a long time to work out what that was. And it just built up and built up and built up. That's why I say the teeth incident was a really amazing experience, other than it cost me a bit of money to get it fixed. But anyway, you know, and the pain. But the point was, it actually taught me that I had to make that change. So I'm lucky I had that.
And so let's shift here to scale up your business. The last thing I'll say on this is part of it is not being aware of it. Part of it is you don't want to face it, because if you admit what you really think you are and the mistakes you're making, like, you know, my Crucible was obviously different. It was a lot of my own mistakes, so it's hard for me to ignore, you know, the $2.25 billion failure. But yeah, I mean, it's painful to look at yourself, at your mistakes and things that you've done wrong. So sometimes it's lack of awareness. Sometimes it's, I don't want to be aware, because if I'm aware of it, it's going to be excruciatingly painful. So I'd rather, you know, ignorance is bliss kind of thing. So it's a bit of both, but I think for many. But so talk about how you pivoted in a way that many successful private equity folks don't, because you're on this train doing super well, and there's always a desire for the next deal because it's fun. It's super exciting, the thrill of the chase. But talk about what your whole vision is with Scale Up Your Business. You have a podcast and consultancy, professional partnerships you do through it. Talk about what your vision was for Scale Up Your Business as you started it.
Yeah, sure. One of the things that I realized was that I needed to be more externally focused as opposed to focusing on myself. And I had a bit of coaching on that, actually. It was about, you know, I had high achievement, low fulfillment. Why is that the case? Because I'm not making a difference enough. Mm-hmm. So the podcast was the first thing I started. So I didn't quit the private equity firm straight away. I was making a certain amount of money that I didn't want my family to suffer by any change that I was going through, or any midlife crisis, right? So I started the podcast, and I did that because of two reasons. I wanted to help people, and I wanted to have a platform to sort of share all the experiences I had in growing and scaling businesses. But if I'm honest with you guys, it was also cathartic. Mm-hmm. You know, it's a little bit like if you journal or you go to therapy, mm-hmm. just by saying the things, it helps you. So if you go to the early episodes, a lot of it is me in a dark room just talking into a microphone. I didn't do interviews for a long time. It's me for an hour just talking and sharing all of the war stories, right? And putting a perspective on it. But what I had in the back of my mind, which kind of drove that as well, was what happens if I jumped over the other side of the table? So I'm not going to leave the world fully, because it's all I know. It's what I've done. But what happens if I sit on the same side as the entrepreneur? What happens if, you know, when they're going to sell their business and the private equity firms come or the corporates come or whatever, I'm sitting next to them, right? With all the experiences I've had of being on that side. And so the whole thing was, what would that do? And I started to scratch that, you know, play with that. And I realized that there was a massive gap of no one really doing that. So I built sort of consultancy education, all that sort of thing around how can you build a business so valuable that you create a life-changing exit? What does that look like? Which is the scale up piece. And then when you get to that process, the final piece, the pathway to a sale, what sort of support do you need to be able to do that effectively so that you are leveling the table stakes against some very impressive people that may be on the other side? And so Scale Up Your Business became that. And it came off the podcast, but it became more than that because of that one decision.
So it feels like, in a sense, it's not so much like standing up for the little guy, but relative to some of these big private equity firms, it probably feels a little bit like sort of David and Goliath, or you're standing up for folks, you're helping them give some tools and maximize their value, trying to level the playing field a little bit, and because I guess you could see your dad in a lot of these folks. You want to stand up for entrepreneurs, and they may not be financial geniuses, but they have a vision for their business. And I want to say it was a ministry. You got paid for all that, but there was an altruistic. It wasn't, if it just was about money, there's probably better ways to make money than helping entrepreneurs through a podcast. You've done unbelievably well. It's just staggering. But do you know what I mean? Clearly your motive for this pivot wasn't, how am I going to maximize personal, Nick Bradley shareholder value, right?
Well, it wasn't, but I separated the two things, right? Yeah. So one of the things you learn from private equity is you learn how to buy businesses, right? That's the whole play.
Sure.
So I buy businesses now. right? I
Yeah.
buy my own businesses.
Sure.
So I build wealth by building out, that. And I know how to roll businesses up and sell them to private equity. So I do that.
Sure.
So, the coaching consultancy side of what I do, I don't look at that as, oh my God, I've got to have a 7-figure
Sure.
business like that, because I'm approaching it in a different way. It's been more successful because I can pick and choose who I work with. It's not like, I don't treat it in the traditional
Right.
business sense.
Right.
I
Right.
treat it like something that's of more of an interest to me.
Okay. Okay. No, that makes total sense. So, some of the things you say and scale up your business, and some of the interviews you've done is, and I'm certainly aware of this. You've often got entrepreneurs that get their whole identity in the business. They won't let go. They won't bring professional managements, and you would know far more than I do. I don't know whether the number is 10 million or whatever the number is. At a certain point, they can't do it all, but they want to do it. They're just clinging to it, and their identity's all wrapped up into it. They won't bring professional managers. They can still be the keeper of the vision, but bring in a good chief executive. I know you've seen this a million times, but it sounds like you're trying to come alongside those folks and help them say, hey, if you want to get to the next level or any level, you got to let go. So is that kind of something part of what you do with entrepreneurs?
My quote is this, and I say this probably more times than I need to. I even said it today with a client. I said, you can only scale a business to the level of your identity.
Wow.
And so if you unpack that, right, what does that mean? It means how you think about things, what you want to create, your bigger vision. I talk about 20-year visions and things like that with people. A lot of the time I'm working on the person's mindset before I'm getting involved in the skill set that's going to allow them to create what they're trying to create. And that's the piece. If you ask me why is Scale Up Your Business, the podcast, been successful, is it's really a podcast about mindset. It's who you need to be, interwoven with how do you raise money, how do you do better sales and marketing. But it's not really about the business side as much as it is about the mindset side.
Right, because if you don't fix your mindset, the other stuff won't happen. You won't
That's
maximize profitability, shareholder value, or be able to sell your business at a level that you would want to. So, I mean, that's fascinating.
One of the things,
Go ahead.
one of the things that, hearing you say that, Nick, one of the things that strikes me as is that there's a lot of scale up things we can say that seem to apply here. Scale up your authenticity, right? If that's part of your mindset, scale up your authenticity is a way to keep yourself from that place where you're successful on the outside but not on the inside. Scale up your significance, to use a word that Warwick uses a lot in helping people find their path to a life of significance. And then a word that you use when we asked you in a questionnaire that we give to all guests, if we could only ask you one question, what would it be? And you said, what's the impact or legacy you want to leave? There's an aspect there too, right, of scale up your legacy. That's really kind of what happens when you change your mindset along the lines of what you're talking about, right?
Yeah, I mean, and one of the things I have a sort of a mantra that I created in a somewhat bizarre way, and it's be grateful, be brave, have faith, and show up, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the whole idea, gratitude, like being happy with what you've got. For many times, for many years, I was chasing something, and I wasn't really appreciating what I had, and that was again one of the epiphanies. The whole idea about being brave, I think so many people don't face their fears. They wait, they think things are going to be much worse if they take action on something, before they've even done it. And that's just such a travesty for me. Faith is not necessarily a religious thing. It's partly around self-belief.
Mm-hmm.
And showing up is taking action. Again, a lot of people, they're going to do this. They should have done that. For me, it's about how you hold yourself accountable with a certain amount of discipline to make things happen. And so to your point, Gary, I think scaling up is, firstly, what do I need to be? Who do I need to become? And how am I going to do that to be able to build a business, build a life, make an impact? And that's kind of where everything's kind of culminated into now, which is something I wouldn't have foreseen when I started this journey a few years back.
That's fascinating, because it sounds like when you say have an impact, you're thinking more just return on equity. You're thinking of it in a much broader way, right? With your family, with your employees, with society. I mean, is that fair? Like when you say impact, it's in the holistic, complete sense of that word, right?
It is. And I think, the reason I point around legacy is I think what I found to be true is once someone ticks the box of, let's call it financial freedom, they don't have to earn money again if they don't choose to. Quite often, not always the case, but quite often they then think, how can I make a bigger impact? How can I go and help people? It's almost like a Maslow's hierarchy thing. I can't remember how that goes, but the point being is like they then go and do something. And I think, and this is probably the bigger thing for me, is I think with everything that's going on in the world right now, you've got, economic stuff going on, political things. There's a lot of things that just seem a bit weird to me. I think entrepreneurs have the ability to make more change. They certainly have more power. Certainly some of the multi-billionaires have, they've got more money than some countries. So for me, making an impact has another sort of moral and social responsibility behind it that comes from entrepreneurship.
And that's the thing that's fascinating to me is that, we've talked before, I'm not against success at all, but success in of itself is not going to satisfy. It's never enough. If the people with 10 million want 100 million, the people with 100 million want a billion, the people with a billion want 10 billion. It's like, oh, yeah, I have a nice house in the Hamptons, or I don't know, somewhere in the country in England, but somebody else has that nice house in Monte Carlo. Well, I have a small jet, somebody else has a bigger jet. It sounds silly, but those folks, people do think like that. It's never enough. There's always somebody else. Well, pretty much, unless you're, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, or whatever, there's always somebody else at another level. So, gosh, I guess I'll probably never be at Jeff Bezos' level. Well, the answer is, yeah, you're probably right. You probably never will be. But so what? It's okay. He's been successful. Good on him. That's great. Fantastic. He has a great business model. More power to him. But, if you have your whole sense of significance in being successful in the next, quarterly earnings reports, I mean, it's not going to make you happy. But when you start thinking, how can we use our business to provide a place where the talent of our employees are unleashed, we're serving the greater good of our community, shareholders, customers, we're making a global impact for good, whatever that might be, that starts scratching the itch of, what, now I'm feeling somewhat joyful and fulfilled. I mean, I don't know if you can have it all, but I think with the right mindset, maybe, sounds a little optimistic. Can you have money and be happy? Yes, but you've got to think of the bigger game, the wider impact. I mean, have you found that with people you've worked with, that they're actually beginning to feel joyful and fulfilled, and they're successful too?
Yeah, it's absolutely possible. I mean, you've got to think of it from the perspective. I mentioned a couple of words during our conversation. I mentioned the word achievement and the word of fulfillment, right? And this was something that I had to kind of learn myself, is that you can have high achievement and high fulfillment, but high achievement in its own right won't make you happy. So, Porsches, Ferraris, big houses, private jets, achieve, I'm growing, all that sort of stuff. Unless you can, give something back, it doesn't help you. And I found that this is the big thing for me, and I've seen it with others, is I just didn't understand that. The quote that changed everything for me was the Zig Ziglar quote. It's often overused, but if you help a person, get what they want in life, you'll have everything you want and need in life. Now, I'd never heard that until about 3 or 4 years ago, and I thought, wow, that's weird. So if I help other people, I'm gonna have everything I need. Yes. So what did I do? Honestly, this is how it happened. I launched the podcast after that quote, because I had no awareness beforehand.
And I bet just with the people you've interviewed and what you've been doing on Scale Up Your Business, having an impact in a broader sense, I'm assuming that's been pretty immensely fulfilling. The stories you get to share and the messages and the feedback from people saying, Nick, you changed my life, you changed my business. It's not so much about ego, but when you feel like you're doing something good for somebody, there's a feeling you get that it's indescribable, that level of joy and fulfillment. I mean, has that been your journey?
It's been life-changing for me in terms of how I look different, right? I feel very, very different. I feel I have more freedom as a result of it, right? And that's not just the money side. That's just the fact that, we talked about before, and we joked around the number of downloads and all that. I don't really care too much about that. What I do know is I get every single week, I'll get a number of people send me a message, LinkedIn or personal email, telling me their story of how they've been listening to the podcast for a couple of years. They've implemented the stuff that I've suggested, and they've got a successful business, and that's allowing them to do other things. And I go, really? I still shock myself a bit, but I get a lot of personal pride from, my small way, if you like, of making a difference there.
Well, you probably have people say, not only is my business successful, my marriage is better, I'm giving back to the community, I'm happy in the general sense of the word. I'm sure you must have had those messages too, right?
Yeah, because I focus a lot on, as I said, personal development.
Sure.
If personal development and scale up businesses. So
Yeah.
a lot of it's like, what's your routine? What are you
Sure.
doing? How are you looking after your health? We do cover quite a broad range of things. So I've had people who have, lost all this weight, feel better about themselves. It's not a health podcast, but it comes back to the point we've discussed a few times, identity, right? How do you want to be? And, are you asking enough of yourself?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things, and I love what you're saying, that I think it's great that, you're not fixated on how many downloads there are every week. I mean, you look at it every once in a while, but the fact that, what's on your, website or whatever is a little out of date, I think is a pretty good sign, because that means you're not having somebody saying, okay, every week, I want you to update the website team with whatever the latest number is. Okay, just do that. In fact, if you could change it about 5 times a day, that would be ideal. I mean, that would be the ultimate, but that's not where your identity is. I know for me, obviously, is growing up in about as wealthy a family business, 150-year-old, very large media business in Australia with about as much status, money, respect. We had it all. You can have money and not much respect. We had everything: status, respect, money, the whole deal. Politicians, prime ministers, people from Hollywood. But in of itself, it doesn't make you happy. So yeah, I'm a bit like some of the folks you work with. I'm very financially comfortable and very blessed. I mean, not billions comfortable, but that I could have been, more than enough that I do what I do now, not because I have to, it's because I want to. It's not about the money that rolls in. It's all about the impact and change lives. And so I really try to walk the talk. So when I chatted to my publisher, Morgan James, who fortunately is a person of faith, I said to him, look, I don't care whether I sell one book or 10,000. And I'm doing my level best to sell as many as I can. We have a great public relations, event management, branding. We have the best of the best in every avenue, as do you. I mean, you either do it 100% or you don't do it all, is sort of my mindset. But that being said, I'm not going to have my self-esteem based on book sales, or my identity. If I impact one person, that's enough. Again, I'm trying to do everything I need to, but does that make sense? Like, I will not have my identity in numbers. Not that I don't care about it, but numbers doesn't make me a better or worse person than the person over the street. Does that kind of make sense?
When I record an episode of the podcast, I'm only really thinking about one person.
Right.
And it has to help that person. So, and this is the thing, right? Because I haven't been fixated on it, my team tell me the numbers and all this sort of stuff, but I don't care about that. Like, even so, as much as like, I might get someone to come along and say, oh, can we sponsor the podcast? And I'm not saying I'll never do it, but I've had no interest in that.
Right.
Why would I do that? Why would I, hi, this is Nick, we're going to talk about such and such. As I said, I might in the future, I may do that, but the whole premise of doing it was not that. So for me, it was about, can I help people? And from that, I've managed to build a number of businesses because, there's only so much you can do. I'll share this with you. I've done 2 phone calls today where people just wanted to have a quick chat. I say this because I used to do it all the time. So I'm saying it on your podcast, and I just don't have the time to do much of that. But,
sure, of course.
But now and then, like this guy said to me, I'll pay you for an hour of your time. And I said, mate, no, listen, let's just jump on a quick 20-minute call.
Right.
And I'll see if I can help you. And I still try and do that as much as I can.
Sure. Boy, that's brilliant. So, yeah, I mean, it sounds like you are now helping people live fulfilled lives. I mean, as Gary said earlier, helping people scale up their business, but their legacy, their life of significance. I mean, to me, I've found, if you want to be joyful and fulfilled, from our perspective, you've got to live a life of significance, which is a life on purpose dedicated to serving others. That's the secret. And I'm not so much judging people. It's just objectively, I don't know any human that's happy without doing that. And, you can complain about the creator or the universe or whatever. It's just is what it is. And, kind of if you're human, you got to live with it, which is you want to be happy and fulfilled. You got to figure out more than the bank account and, how you can help others. And you've certainly, have proven that. I mean, you think of some of the great robber barons in the 1800s in the U.S., there aren't too many that didn't learn that later in life. You've got, Rockefeller has, foundations, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, Andrew Carnegie, pretty much most of them, they kind of did whatever they could to be successful. Back then, the laws weren't what it is now, so there probably weren't as many laws to break. You just did whatever you could to win. And I'm sure most, if not all of them, were extremely cutthroat. But then at a certain point, I don't know if they grew a conscience, but they said, is this all there is? And so they set up these massive foundations. I just find it fascinating that some of the wealthiest people in the history of the world, in terms of, the growth of their business, equity, and all the rest, found that sense of, gosh, there's got to be more to life than just money. I've got to give back somehow. Now, you could say, well, it's to assuage a guilty conscience. Maybe. But I just find it fascinating that a lot of these folks at some point said, there's more to life than just money. I want to have a bigger impact. Does that kind of make sense?
But you answered this already by saying, it's the human condition, right? Like, this is the thing. Like, I don't think people who go out there and like, let's say, I'm always going to play to win. You see this in sport. Like, there's a great documentary about Michael Jordan, right? The Last Dance, where he's so driven to win. He's not a very nice person. You look at the scoreboard, you look at the championships, and you go, wow. But he seems quite conflicted to me, right? So I think there's a point here where, success on the outside, a lot of people look successful, but unless they're doing the inner stuff, unless they're doing what we just talked about, a lot of them are just not happy. And ultimately, we want to be happy, right?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned sports. I mean, I think of, as you would know, all Australians tend to be follow tennis, and, at least there's about as many that play tennis as golf in Australia, which is not true in the US, at least not for men. But I think of Roger Federer, and he's somebody that, equal holder of, 20 majors, which will, probably be broken by Djokovic pretty soon, if not Nadal. But you just sense that he is internally very happy. He has a couple sets of twins and, wife that he loves. He has a foundation that helps a lot of folks in Africa. I mean, he seems genuinely at peace with himself. It's not about numbers. He just loves doing it. But yet there are other things that he uses his fame for to help others. I mean, to me, it seems like he's living, relatively speaking, a balanced life, a life of significance. Everybody thinks he's a super nice guy, and he seems to be at peace. Well, there's some lessons to be learned from him and others, they're doing it right in sports, if you will.
Absolutely. I mean, I had the privilege of meeting Hugh Jackman a few years ago.
Okay.
Right? And he was, pretty damn nice as well.
The famous
successful. So you don't have to be an arse, if I can use that word on your podcast, to be successful. And I think, if I go back to the story I shared, I kind of thought you had to be. And I surrounded myself with like types. And it was only when I made some of the different choices that I realized, whether it's balance or whether it's just the fact that, you can do things in different ways. But, the key thing, just to do an underline of this, people's values are different.
Sure.
What I was doing just didn't work for me. And I had to change that. And I think that's one of the things I want to get across. If you've got that sort of feeling, you're listening to this and you've got that feeling in your stomach that I meant to do more, or what I'm doing now is not my purpose, or I need to change. The worst thing I think you can do is just not listen to that niggle or that voice. Because my belief, right, is at some point, if you don't, it's either going to do what happened to me. You might get sick. That might be a blessing for you because it might make you change. Or worse, you're going to get to the ends and you're going to go, did I actually play all out? Did I play the game that was going to get me what was really going to make me happy?
And I want listeners to hear. Well, let me just.
Go ahead, Ward. Yeah.
I want listeners to hear what you just said, because I think it's really so profound. Is that I find, at least within my coaching, I'm a certified executive coach. The issue is not so much people's values are all messed up. The issue is more often than not they're not living in light of their own values. I mean, you, from your admission, kind of weren't. So it's like, if you live out of line with what you believe in your heart, that will cause you anxiety, poor health. That will take a toll. So it's not about making other people happy in the sense of living their values. if you live out of line with your own values, that is the path to poor health and misery. And so that's really, in another sense, you could say you're fighting for people's souls. I mean, one other kind of beat on this is that, there's this notion of, well, is it success or significance? I would argue that if you want to be truly successful, even financially, you're leaving, if you're Mr. Competitive or Miss Competitive, you're leaving stuff on the table if you don't look at this wider game. Because you could be more successful, even financially successful than you are, if you think about maybe, to use an oft-used phrase, treasuring your employees. With your customers, it's like, rather than trying to say, well, yeah, you should have read the fine print in the contract. Customers aren't going to like that. You may be, quote unquote, legally fine, but they'll go elsewhere. If you want to create long-term profitability, if you are seen as somebody that cares about their employees, their customers, their world, their community, all things being equal, who would you rather work with? The guy or the woman that kind of has that more altruistic look on life, or somebody else. So again, I'm an idealist at heart, but I think if anything, you won't be less successful doing what you're advocating about: scale up your business, scale up your legacy, if you will, scale up your significance. If anything, I think you could be as, if not even more successful. So it's not an either or choice. It's not like, living your values means you're going to be less successful in the long term. But I don't know, does that make any kind of sense? I know I'm a little idealistic here.
I know Gary wants to jump in, but people are scared, I think, of being vulnerable, right? So the point is, if you do some deeper work on actually what you do value, if you really understand what that means and why your values are what they are, because for me, it was explained to me, and I believe this to be true as well, is that your values aren't just a couple of words that you put on a piece of paper, like integrity, honesty. Well, it's not that, right? It's more deep-seated than that. And it was expressed to me that sometimes your voids become your values. Mm-hmm. The things that you missed out on growing up or whatever that weren't around you, they become the things you value the most. And so once you understand those things, they also then help you to understand what motivates you. And then, once you have more self-awareness, you then, I think, have more completeness. So I'm happy being vulnerable about what, I've done and what I've, I said before we press record, you can ask me anything. I'll just answer it, because I've done the work to understand what makes me who I am. Mm-hmm. But a lot of people have never done that. Therefore, they don't lean into it. And therefore, they're too scared to lean into it in case it unpacks something uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. But sometimes you've got to go there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Nick is correct, but I was trying to jump in. That's because I wanted to say to you, listener, that bell that you heard go off wasn't because Nick said ass. Ass is perfectly okay to say on the show. No, that's perfectly okay. The bell was the captain announcing that it's about time to land the plane. So fasten your seatbelts and get ready for landing. But before we do land the plane, Nick, I would be remiss if I did not give you the chance to let listeners know where they can find the Scale Up Your Business podcast and where they can learn more about your consultancy work.
Yeah, sure. Well, actually, what's quite interesting, in 2 days' time, I know people will listen to this, in the dimension of time, right? So what does that mean? Scale Up Your Business is now called Scale Up with Nick Bradley for two reasons. Partly because the guests that I've got lined up to come on the show are not just business magnates or people like that. I've got some interesting people from the world of sport coming on and all sorts. So we're talking a little bit more about scaling up more generally. But yeah, you can find that Spotify, iTunes. You can look for my somewhat ugly face on the front of it. That's cool. Look me up there. And then, if people want to kind of, the coaching and consultancy we do is at Scale Up Your Business. It's SUYB. So scaleupyourbusiness.global. And you can check us out there.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Nick. I mean, as we kind of close, when you're thinking, it's interesting you're changing your name to Scale Up, what would be a message of hope, encouragement that you would have for folks that are listening to you, maybe business owners, maybe people in general? What would be a kind of a message of hope that you would offer?
I think, I said this earlier, that I feel very, very lucky and a huge amount of gratitude that I had my dad come back, him passing away also, and then the teeth thing, all of that happening in, that all happened in my sort of, late 30s, early 40s, around that time. So I had the message. And And had I not done that, had that not have happened, I probably would have stayed in my lane. So my message to people is, as I said previously, if you're doing something you hate, right? Oh, you're doing something that doesn't feel aligned with what you really want to be doing. You owe it to yourself and to others to explore that. That doesn't mean, the romantic ideal of burning the boats, giving up everything. I'm going to quit my job tomorrow and go and do this new venture. It doesn't mean that. Okay. It means creating the platform, the space to explore. Because if you don't do that, we've said before, I think you could then regret. But what I will also say from someone who's jumped to the other side is it's really good on the other side. So any fear that you have to do that is absolutely worth, pushing through to get to something which, potentially could change the whole game, the whole experience for you.
I have been in the communications business long enough to know when the last word's been spoken on a subject, and Nick has just spoken it. Listener, thank you for spending this time with us on Beyond the Crucible. That's still the name of the show. We're not changing it in the near future, we don't think. But who knows? Never say never. And until the next time, though, we are together, we ask that you remember this, and you heard it on display in our conversation with Nick Bradley today. Your crucibles, we realize, we know, are painful. They are traumatic. They're difficult to move beyond, but they're not the end of your story. And that's what this show's all about. And I hope that's what you glean from this conversation with Nick. His teeth incident, as he calls it, despite all of our chuckles at the name, was painful, but it wasn't the end of his story. In fact, it was the start of a new chapter in his story. And your crucible can be the start of a new chapter in your story as well. And it can be the best chapter in your story, as it has been for Nick, because where it leads you to, if you learn the lessons of that crucible, is to a life of significance.